once again, welcome everyone to Next Practices Weekly. If you could keep the chat open, if you haven't yet, please introduce yourself there. Let us know where you're joining from. I think I saw folks joining from pretty much all the different states. Saw Canada, UK represented. We always have a global audience here, so special welcome to folks maybe joining us from outside North America. If you're new to I4CP, we are the Institute for Corporate Productivity. We're your human capital research partner. We discover the people practices that drive high performance. We define this with 4 pretty standard business metrics: revenue growth, profitability, market share, and customer satisfaction. We do major studies each year, 4 to 6 of them, on different areas within HR, different areas in human capital. We like to tease out what the high-performing companies, that top quartile, are doing differently in their human capital practices than their low-performing counterparts. We're also a member-based community. You see here just a small sampling of the hundreds of member organizations that we have. They range from very large organizations like Amazon, Microsoft, 3M, and others. We've got a growing cohort of unicorn startup companies. We've got regional banks and healthcare, really all industries and market verticals included in the I4CP member community. If you're with one of those member companies, special welcome to you. Great to have you with us. If you're not with a member company but would like to learn more about what that is involved in that, what it entails, just reach out to anyone at I4CP, hit us up on LinkedIn, or go to i4cp.com and we'd be happy to get you that information. My name is Tom Stone. I'm a senior research analyst here at I4CP, and most weeks I have the pleasure of co-hosting these Next Practice Weekly sessions. And this week I am joined by my colleague, VP of Research, Lorrie Lykins. Good morning, Lorrie.
Hi, Tom. Great to be with you.
Great to be with you. You're going to be leading the conversation, facilitating the conversation with our special guest, who we'll bring on in just a few moments. But we have a few quick other announcements. Starting off, always want to remind folks, this is Next Practices Weekly. You see the dates there on the right. Some of the guests we'll be having coming up on the 8th, the 15th, and the 22nd. We've got 2 HR leaders from Accenture. Then we're bringing back Brian Elliott to talk more about flexible work, and in this case, leaning more into return to office policies. And then, yes, that is Van Jones, the Van Jones that you may be familiar with from CNN. He will be our special guest on May 22nd. Couple of other things that we wanted to announce and remind folks of. As I said earlier, we do 4 to 6 major HR studies every year, but we also do a series of very timely pulse surveys. And the latest one, just launched either last night or early this morning, is on agentic AI. I want to quote Salesforce CEO Mark Benioff, who recently said, I think this was at a World Economic Forum event, "We are the last CEOs who are only going to be managing humans as our workforce." He went on to say, "From this point forward, we will be managing not only human workers, but also digital workers." And that's what agentic AI is all about. It goes far beyond what you've used ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot for, prompting, asking it a question, having a chat conversation back and forth to get the info or insights that you need. It's more about several of these systems working together to bring about the outcomes or tasks that you've set them for. So if you are familiar with how your organization maybe is already using agentic AI, or if you know who is in your company, please either take the survey yourself or pass along the URL. Thank you, Zeta, for putting that already over in the chat. Folks can click that and return to that survey later. We'd love to get several hundred responses to this quick pulse survey. And we'd love as many folks from the call today to represent your companies in doing so. The other thing that we wanted to talk through is the obvious market uncertainty that we've got right now in the business world, in the US and worldwide. Next Practices Weekly, this call series started in March of 2020 or April of 2020, early on during the pandemic, when obviously all of us were facing a great deal of uncertainty then as well. And it seems that while we don't have a pandemic, 2025 is shaping up to be much the same, with a lot of disruption, a lot of uncertainty in a lot of ways. And we're providing a lot of resources to our members and the broader HR community. Lorrie, could you say a little bit more, set some context for this and what we have available?
Sure. As Tom said, we started the Next Practices Weekly series during COVID because we really came together as a team and asked ourselves, what can we do to help everybody? So we open this up to the public to just create a global community as we all figured out what in the world was going on, and what was next. So we're continuing to do that in terms of the disruption that we've been experiencing with the executive orders that really created some disruption in January, and now the disruption and some chaos with the tariffs. So we've run some surveys, we've written a couple of pieces. We've got some great insights into what organizations are doing around responding to the tariffs, what actions are on the table right now in terms of how to adapt to what's happening. So we just, as Tom said, we just posted a whole series of resources. I think we have 13 resources on the website right now specific to tariff response, what you should be thinking about, what you can do. So definitely check it out. It's there for you and our member community.
Yeah, thanks, Lorrie, for that.
Sure.
There's both a link in the chat that Zeta has added, and you can also scan the QR code that's been on the screen. All right, with that, I wanted to mention that pulse survey on agentic AI and this set of resources on tariffs and market uncertainty. But let's move on to the star of the hour, and I'm going to turn things back over to you, Lorrie, to introduce today's special guest.
Okay, Tom, thanks. All right, so I've so been looking forward to this conversation. And I just feel like we're also lucky to be on this call with Joann today. Joann is an absolute legend in the world of journalism. And I say this from a place of experience because I began my career in a newsroom as an investigative journalist. She has done absolutely groundbreaking work as a career journalist with the Wall Street Journal, covering the business world and workplace issues ranging from executive pay and succession planning to corporate governance and recruiting trends. Just a few career highlights of Joann. She worked as a reporter in the San Francisco and Chicago and DC bureaus of the Wall Street Journal. I know we have folks on the call from all of those cities today, where she covered labor issues and urban affairs. And then the big move across the pond. She became the news editor of the Wall Street Journal's London bureau, and in doing so became the first woman at the Wall Street Journal to helm a bureau, which is a really big deal because, as we all know, journalism has historically been an exceedingly male-dominated field. And then she transferred back to New York City to the Wall Street Journal's Manhattan bureau in 1990, where she covered management. A lot of the big corporate scandals that were going on at the time. And for that work, she was part of a team that won a Pulitzer for that reporting. And finally, Joann recently received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Gerald Loeb Awards, which is the Pulitzer of business journalism. So she's a really impressive person. I'm just really appreciative. Joann, welcome. Thank you so much for carving out time to be with us today.
And being the journalist I am, I do have to fact check a little here.
Okay, go for it.
When I became the news editor in the London bureau, it was the first bureau that was run by women because my bureau chief was the woman who was the first female bureau chief at the Wall Street Journal. And so now we had two women running a bureau, and that was unprecedented at the Journal.
So I'm imagining because of that, you were able to drive some change while you were there as well.
Not huge amount of change.
But a little bit, yeah.
That's why I wrote my books.
Okay. So speaking of the books, Joann's the author of two books. Her first book, Earning It, is based on interviews that she did with over 50 executive women, just about their career trajectories and all of the challenges that they faced, and how they ascended to the highest, rung on the corporate ladder. So she interviewed women such as Carly Fiorna, who was the CEO of Hewlett Packard at the time, Mary Barra, who was the CEO of General Motors, and Brenda Barnes, this former CEO of Sara Lee, all of whom were the first women to run their companies as CEO. Her latest book, which is what we're going to talk about today, is Power Moms: How Executive Mothers Navigate Work and Life. And that's where we're going to begin that conversation. So you ready? Can I fire away?
Sure.
Okay. So speaking of trailblazing, what was it like being probably one of the first or among the first pregnant journalists in the newsroom at the Wall Street Journal so early in your career too?
Well, what was interesting that there were several women at the Journal who were all reporters like me all of whom in an unprecedented action announced their pregnancies within a 2-week period.
Oh,
Managing editor just about went nuts. He said, this wasn't in my job description. Now what do I do? But then I also discovered that being a pregnant journalist was not such an easy task either. So at one point in one day, I had 2 different PR guys pat my rotund tummy without my permission. And because this was early days in terms of working women and working moms, I didn't feel I had the legitimacy to say, hands off, guys. At the same time, I discovered we had a very strange maternity leave policy. It was 10 weeks, which seemed pretty generous, but it turned out you had to take 4 weeks before the baby came, and then you got 6 weeks of paid leave afterwards. I went to my bureau chief, who was the DC bureau, where I transferred 7 months pregnant, by the way, and said, can I take all 10 weeks afterwards? I don't want to sit around for a month staring at an empty crib. And he said, sure, we just won't tell HR.
so I know that you were among one of the first women to return to work, and this is such a tough issue, returning to work following maternity leave. And I know I shared with you earlier, my own daughter is really experiencing this as we speak, really grappling with what it's like to return to work following maternity leave. It always feels too soon. I don't care how long it is. But how did your experiences shape your views on workplace policies for mothers?
Well, I had a very difficult return to work, as women today continue to experience. But in my case, I was one of 2 women in the Washington Bureau who declared their pregnancies at the same time, but the other one didn't come back. And so when I returned, it wasn't exactly with open arms. I got cracks from some of my male colleagues, such as, you could be home rocking your baby in a cradle, or where do you park your kid all day? And this kind of really disparaging treatment, and not really any transition that I was aware of in terms of assistance from my employer, made me recognize that the situation for working mothers was even more difficult than the one for working women, which I had already been aware of. And it also gave me pause to think about what needed to happen differently. And over the years, not at that time, but in more recent years, it came to me to recognize that we needed to have employee resource groups that were targeting not only working women, but working parents. We needed to have management that was committed to the idea that you don't stop being a parent when you come to the office, and you don't stop being an employee when you get home. But most importantly, it made me recognize that we needed government mandated actions on issues like paid parental leave. And all those issues remain front and center, unfortunately, today.
Before we get into talking about the stories from the book, I would love it, Joann, if you would share the story of your own experience when you were negotiating your return to work and your schedule, and you had 2 very different experiences with one manager, and then there was a change of who you were directly reporting to, and it was kind of a different scenario. Would you mind sharing that story?
Sure. So the backstory here is that I was pregnant with our second child when our first child, our son, was around 3. And I did intend to come back to work full time, but it occurred to me that it would be great if I could work a reduced schedule, maybe 4 days a week rather than 5 days a week. And so I put together a formal proposal while I was pregnant, before I went out on my second maternity leave. It was turned down not only well, my bureau chief in the DC bureau didn't turn it down. He simply took a neutral position and said, I'll forward this to the brass in New York. And the top brass in New York said no. And so I returned to work, and it was very difficult having essentially 2 children under 4. But then, as you point out, management changed. I got a new bureau chief, a guy named Al Hunt, married to Judy Woodruff. They already had a child. There was a new managing editor. He had a working wife. And that new managing editor actually asked me my reaction to a Page One journal story, which appeared when my daughter was about 9 months old. And the Page One journal story was about the fact that more working moms were quitting after coming back to work when their kid was about 2 or 3. And when he asked me my reaction, I said, well, I proposed a part-time schedule. I was willing to take a 20% cut in pay and benefits and got turned down. And he was like, really? I want to see that proposal. So long story short, I not only got my reduced work schedule, but they kept me at the same pay and benefits.
And the lesson that I love that you shared with me earlier is that you realized in hindsight that you underestimated your own value.
Exactly. So then when I interviewed Al Hunt for Power Moms and said to him, why did you give me such a special deal? One that was such a special deal, I kept it secret. I didn't even tell anybody in the journal about it. I was afraid it would create more resentment by the guys. And he said, well, we were afraid if we didn't give you that special deal, you would quit the journal and go work elsewhere. In other words, I undervalued my own worth in that workplace, which too often women today continue to do. And very often men overvalue their worth. Again, generalization on both fronts. I think women have gotten a lot savvier about valuing their worth, but too often I don't think we do recognize that.
I agree. Okay, so let's talk about Power Moms. I think the format of the book itself is really interesting. Can you share a little bit with everybody about how you structured the book and why?
So the way I structured the book was I interviewed 2 different generations of women who had become executives and also moms. The first wave, which were members of my generation, the baby boomers, and the second wave, who were women from anywhere in their early 30s to early 40s when I conducted the interviews. These were Gen Xers for the most part, as well as millennials. In addition to that, I interviewed more than 24 adult daughters of the boomers. And what I was mainly trying to find out was whether things had gotten any better for the younger wave, the second wave of women who were now becoming executives and also had children. Was it different? Was it better? Was it worse? Was it the same?
So what did you learn in that research?
Well, what I found was that the boomers typically lacked role models and basically were stigmatized as working moms. They were afraid to display photos at work. If they had bring your daughter to work day or bring your son to work day, they were reluctant to do that. They were afraid it would just further isolate them and be seen as people who were not committed to their careers. And to my great delight, the Gen Xers and the millennials were able to navigate both parenthood and their careers with much greater ease and less angst. And that was due to 3 factors. Number 1, there were advances in technology. The boomers, if they were lucky, could dial up online once they got home, and were more likely to stay at work late because it just was too time consuming to get back to work once they got home. The second thing was that this younger wave had more involved spouses. And the third and most important was they had more supportive employers. And those employers were more supportive because guess what? There were more women in senior management. Many of whom were those boomers who had been the trailblazers I wrote about in Earning It.
Yeah. Some of the stories that you shared with us earlier about the interviews that you did with adult daughters who had executive working moms. And some of them shared the impact of being raised by high achieving moms or power moms. What was the most prevalent theme in terms of those conversations that you had with those adult daughters?
Well, I found that how they viewed their moms differed depending at what age you were asking them about. And so, as a group, they experienced a mixture of resentment, pride, and gratitude. One of those adult daughters said she felt, quote, pressure to be big and great, close quotes, just like her mom. That young woman's high school and college invited her mother to be its commencement speaker. Talk about being overshadowed by your larger than life mom. Yet, as they entered the world of work, as they got into college and began to look towards what they were going to do job-wise, they were thrilled when, as one of these adult daughters put it, she discovered she had a, quote, built-in career coach in terms of her mom. Mom opened doors. She prepped the daughter for those job interviews. She critiqued their resumes. And when they got that first job, she gave them great tips for getting ahead. And in fact, that secret career coach known as AKA Mom was so helpful that some of these daughters' friends said, could your mom also look at my LinkedIn profile or my cover letter? And so it was kind of ironic that these young women who, as elementary school and middle school kids, felt that mom was never there, which was not true, or was always on a business trip, which was also not true, was actually a great asset.
And I know I shared my own personal story of that, how we as moms perceive things very differently than our kids, but at the time we don't realize it. But one of my biggest sources of mom guilt was that I was not in town for my daughter's middle school graduation. I was out of town because I was defending my thesis. I was finishing graduate school, and I just felt really like a bad mom for that. And I had, like, a week before that, was picking my daughter up at school, and they were just wrapping up an event, and there was a group of stay-at-home moms sort of standing there, and one of them turned around and said, "Oh my gosh, Lorrie, you're here. You're never here." And I just thought, oh God, this is but I asked my daughter about it when she became an adult, and she's like, "Mom, I thought that you were just the coolest mom ever. And that graduation was amazing because you sent flowers and made sure I had a great gift, and we FaceTimed, and it was awesome." But our perspectives are very different. And the hindsight is just a really fascinating thing. I thought I was a bad mom. My daughter thought I was awesome. So
And your daughter, who's now a new mom, is also going to be an awesome mother for her child.
oh, thank you. So I am so fascinated by your marriage contract with your husband, and I'm also really fascinated about this whole idea of strategic planning sessions with our partners. Can you share a little bit about that?
So when my husband and I decided to get married, I realized that at that time, and this was the 1970s, that married women had really limited legal rights. They have more legal rights today, but not even enough, in my opinion. But I also learned that in the 1800s, that the early suffragists, who had even fewer legal rights when they got married, had come up with this idea of a marriage contract. And so we decided to pull one together in which he accepted my right to keep my name after we got married, which he had initially objected to. I, in turn, said that if we had children, they could have his last name, but they would have to have my middle name. But there were two other parts of that contract that I think were even more important. And one was, how were we going to handle the fact we were a two-career couple, a much bigger issue today than it even was then. And what we put in the marriage contract was we would take turns deciding who chose where we lived. So he moved out to California to join me. Then he wanted to go back to grad school, so we moved to Chicago, and the Journal gave me a transfer there. Then it was my turn, and I was offered this transfer to Washington 7 months pregnant, so he followed me. And that's where the contract fell apart, because when I got offered the transfer and promotion into management to go to London, technically I had to turn it down because it was his turn. And he's like, "Are you nuts? We've always wanted to live overseas. We can suspend the contract for now." The other part that was really important was how we were going to share household duties. And the one sentence that did not get put into legalese by the lawyer who drew this up was one that my husband Mike wrote. And it was that household duties shall be shared equally, but not necessarily cheerfully.
But I love that you sat down and put it in writing. So it gave you that clarity of responsibilities and expectations. I think we're always going to fail to meet each other's expectations if we actually don't know what they are, right? So I think that's just a brilliant thing. All right, so do you find that today's power moms regularly have career and household chores and the mother load conversations before having kids? As I know you recommend, that's really wise counsel and advice, but are most parents doing that today?
I haven't done a scientific survey, but I think if I4CP wanted to do such a survey, it would find that this is not a common practice, that it's more widespread perhaps than it was by the first two waves of Power Moms. But I think it's really important to do so. And those who are making sure these conversations happen either before they marry or enter a long-term relationship. They make sure that future partner promises not only to parent equally, but to split household chores fairly and to be committed to advancing each other's career. What I found in reporting the book is that some also conduct regular checkups about how well those expectations are being met. There was a younger wave mom named Morgan Doohan who devised a formal check-in system with her husband really early in their relationship. I think really, frankly, after they got married. And so she and her surgeon husband hold quarterly what they call strategic planning meetings, totally modeled on what she learned in the world of work. In their case, they take place in the kitchen, usually over a glass of wine, and they talk about what's working and not working, not just in their division of labor, but in their relationship, in their marriage.
So this is almost a rhetorical question, but based on your research and all of the interviews that you've done over the years, Joann, why do you think that the burden of parenting and running a household just continues to disproportionately fall on women? I mean, we don't talk about working dads, right?
Well, we are talking about working dads to a lot greater extent than we used to. But that term only entered the lexicon
Recently.
recently, at the
Yeah.
time I was reporting my book several years ago.
Yeah.
And that's because we still live in a world with gendered role expectations. And those gendered role expectations affect men and women alike. Who do the schools call when Johnny is sick? They generally call mom. Why do such a low percentage of men take their full parental leave even when it's paid? Because those new dads think they're going to be seen as somehow less committed to their careers. Been
Right.
there, done that as working moms. And so I think there's several solutions here. For couples, you should alternate whose name you list first on those emergency contact forms for your kids' schools. If you have more than one kid, put dad's name first on one and mom's on the other. Management should require unconscious bias training on a regular basis, company-wide. And then there's a more radical idea, which some people are now advocating, which is that there ought to be mandatory parental leave for men.
And we know, and we have international folks participating on the call today. We know some countries are really much more forward thinking on that as well. I think the fact that we don't have paid parental leave in the US is just it's a real detriment, not only to the culture and the society, but to business, seriously. I love some of the strategies that you've recommended. I love the idea of maybe proposing a phased return to work following maternity leave. Do you think that's something that will be more widely adopted, in the coming years? I think it's a great idea.
Well, the concept of phased return to work is fairly well established, but the problem is in most workplaces, it's not paid at full-time pay levels.
Yeah.
And what I found very impressive by several of the workplaces that I write about in Power Moms is that they not only have the phased return, but the phased return for parents of both genders is at full-time pay. Do I think we'll see more workplaces adopting phased return to work? Yes. Do I think we'll see more workplaces adopting phased return to work at full-time pay? I think you've got to be a real pace setter type of a workplace.
Yeah. But
And
I imagine offering that as a benefit would be a huge talent attractor, right?
I think it would, but you have to be a workplace that's committed to advancing the careers of employed parents.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, that would just really, really burnish employer brand, because it says so much about not only these are the benefits that we're willing to offer, but we're an empathetic organization that gets how critically important this is. So I know we've learned a lot in retrospect, having come through the COVID pandemic. And in some ways there were some shifts, and we definitely observed this in our research through the pandemic, that it gave an opportunity for the younger generations who were more tech savvy to begin with, and also more experience at working remotely. So what do you think in terms of Gen X moms who were already doing some of that work? What lessons did they teach us in terms of navigating remote work successfully? What would you say?
Well, what was interesting is that there were several of those second wave moms who were already working in an executive role full-time remotely before the pandemic hit.
Right.
But in all those cases, the kids weren't underfoot. So they essentially had to rework their work life model and their work model once the pandemic hit. In one case, she and her husband devised an hour-by-hour Excel spreadsheet because they were suddenly supervising their youngsters' education from home. And then they revised that daily spreadsheet every night after having set it up a week in advance. Another already remote younger executive mom was able to negotiate a 4-hour block of what she called her protected hours between 7 and 11 a.m. on weekdays, when her employer, even though the whole rest of the workforce was completely remote, knew she was not going to be reachable. And for those who are continuing to mostly work remotely today, I think there's ways to stay well connected. You give a lot of and frequent progress reports to your boss and look for feedback. You arrange coffees with key colleagues ahead of, say, a hybrid meeting that's going to decide your team's budget or what your to-do list will be for the coming quarter. And then most importantly, you ask an in-person ally to speak up on your behalf during those hybrid meetings if you are used to being overlooked because you're attending virtually.
Yeah. What do you think about the fact that, and this is not scientific, we haven't done research on it, it's just been my own observation. I'm really sad about it too, is that it seems like the younger generations are still struggling with the mom guilt. We talked about this a little earlier, but we have boomers. I'm the Gen X mom of a millennial daughter I'm watching her deal with mom guilt, and it's really tough. And why do you think that's still prevalent with younger generations? And more importantly, what can we do to help break through that?
Well, I think it gets back to this broader issue of the gendered role expectations.
Yeah.
And those haven't evolved enough, in part because of not only social expectations, but because of how people in the workplace look at working moms differently than they look at working fathers. They think somehow she's not going to want to take that promotion or that really heavy duty assignment or the transfer and relocation, say overseas, because she's got a very committed spouse who's got a very demanding career. They don't have those eyebrows raised or questions, posed about giving those promotions or that high visibility assignment to an employed father. And the same reason that, employed fathers don't generally have working dad guilt, because we consider when we think about, well, who is the primary parent? It's mom. A small but meaningful part of that gendered role expectation lands on our own shoulders. We want to feel that we are always available for our children as a working mom, even when our children don't expect us to be always available. And so you get rid of that guilt, hopefully, by reading that chapter in my book, which gives you 10 hacks for getting rid of working mother guilt.
Yeah.
And I think the most important one of those hacks is that self-care is not selfish care. If we don't put on our oxygen masks first, we can't possibly be there for our children and for our spouses.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite chapters in the book. The other one I really love, how you talk about Marissa Mayer from Yahoo and all of the judgment that she endured. Can you talk a little bit about that for some of our folks on the call who are maybe a little bit younger and don't remember the whole CEO at Yahoo?
So if we dial back a couple of years, because we don't even have Yahoo very much around anymore.
Right.
So she becomes the first female CEO of Yahoo. She's one of my second wave power moms. And she comes under a great deal of criticism from her own colleagues because she brings her newborn and the newborn's nanny to the office, basically because she doesn't want to take a huge amount of time off and she wants to be able to nurse her baby while she's there. And yet she gets criticized, even though she actually improves the parental leave benefits for everyone very soon after her return. And yet she comes under criticism once again when she comes back to work less than a month after the second child's birth. This idea of being judged negatively for being a mom and being an executive obviously was much more prevalent among the boomer generation. And I thought a great example of that was Betsy Holden, who ultimately becomes the first female co-CEO of Kraft Foods. And she's already a vice president when she becomes pregnant for the second time. And her male boss says, you know, no one's ever done this job with 2 children. But of course, he had done the job before her. He
Right.
says, how many kids do you have?
Right.
Talking about the fact that no mother with 2 children had ever done the VP job.
Yep. Wow. Okay, one of your assertions that I love and I very much ascribe to is that motherhood absolutely develops intense leadership skills for women. So talk a little bit about that, the parenting traits that transfer really, really well to the workplace.
And again, let's step back for a moment and look at parenthood more generally and then talk about mothers. Because I think increasingly younger men want to be very involved, hands-on dads. And to the extent that you are a hands-on parent from early days, from when the baby arrives, then those men and women alike learn that raising children in turn teaches them how to multitask, teaches them better how to set priorities, and teaches them how to delegate well. Those are all critical talents for being a successful leader in the workplace. But I think motherhood gives women additional insights that make them better leaders in 3 ways. The first is they are highly empathetic listeners. Mom learns to walk in her kid's shoes even before he knows how to walk and even before that child can talk, so she can understand what the baby's temper tantrum is about. So as a boss, she can listen well and actually figure out those unspoken messages because of her empathy. The second trait is patience. I and many other women, I think, were fairly intolerant of slow coworkers before they became moms. And yet we gain boundless patience because you have to. It's the only way you can survive motherhood. That means then, as a boss, we are not only more patient, but we're less prone to anger quickly. The third trait, and I think perhaps the most important, is they become very effective mentors. When you are guiding your children as a mentor, you then effectively guide your team members. And as both a mom and as a leader or as a boss, I think the best mentors lead by example through not only their behavior, but by their ethical stances. how they believe and convey those beliefs to the people that work for them and with them.
Tom, how are we doing on time?
We're doing well. I know you've got a few more questions that we had pre-planned for Joann. I'd say the chat has been on fire, but mostly not so much with questions, but with people chiming in with kudos for all of the insights and nuggets that Joann is sharing, and also folks sharing some of their own stories, whether it's on parenting contract idea, leave policies, self-care.
Yeah.
We've been getting a lot coming through the chat, but let's keep it going.
So what I glean from that is there's a lot of folks on this call who are feeling very seen and very
Yes.
heard. And
Yes.
It's very therapeutic for all of us, for sure. So
For sure.
with that, I really want to get into this. And I know you dig into this very deeply in the book. It's a fascinating section, but your tips for women who are advancing professionally, really fast tracking it, but also planning a family or slash returning from maternity leave.
Well, I have 3 top tips, but I'm going to preface it with a story.
Oh, yeah.
Did an event at one point, actually for earning it, where a 20-something associate at a law firm said she and her husband had recently married and they had already figured out how many years they were going to be married before they had their first child. And would it be all right for her now to tell her boss that in X number of years they were going to have their first kid? I said, no, this is not a good time to be telling your boss that 3 years from now you plan to get pregnant. This is a very private decision, planning a family, deciding how long you're going to take off, deciding whether you're going to come back and on what basis. But I think my 3 top tips would be, number 1 is think about this experience as a work assignment. You're going to craft a detailed game plan. You're going to involve the key colleagues. You're going to revise your plans as you go along because everything's going to change. Secondly, I would encourage you to have your first line supervisor get some extra training, whether it's through your company or through a professional group, but where they learn how to deal with expectant and new parents. There are a lot of companies offering that kind of training, but if it doesn't happen at your workplace, suggest that your boss look for it elsewhere. And thirdly, you should encourage your employer to provide transition counseling. One of the handful of companies that I profile in Power Moms as being ahead of the curve in terms of making work workable for parents is American Express. And American Express has an unlimited new parent concierge. Employees get help planning a family, they get help planning their leave, they get help during their parental leave, and they get help from that concierge upon their return.
Wow. Talk about being an employer of choice. I mean, seriously, that's an amazing benefit. Amazing. Yeah, and I think there's also the issue of the unrealistic expectations. I think not only on the part of the new parent, the first-time parent, but also when that parent returns to the office. You know, one of the things that my own daughter said to me this week is she said, I feel like people just expect me my first week back to just be back at exactly where I was when I left, and I'm not the same person. Everything just feels very different. And I thought it would be this kind of working professional when I came back to work, and I'm not. And it's just a real challenge. So what advice would you give to people returning from parental leave in terms of the conversations they should be having with their managers?
Well, what they need to be having those conversations before they leave,
Yeah.
be having those conversations when the leave is coming to an end. They need to be working in a place like PwC where they have an assigned, guide to each returning mom. And one of those tips that their guide gives to the returning mom is that you should return to work on a Wednesday. So you only have a half a week on your first week back if you don't have phased return. But I also think companies should look at, if they don't bring in a full-fledged new parent concierge. There are a bunch of companies out there that are offering these kind of services on a, project type basis. There's a company called Parentally that does the same kind of thing. And they're training not only the supervisors about how to manage the leave, but they're training the supervisors on how to manage the reentry. Because you shouldn't have to do this by yourself.
Yeah, Parentally is that I really enjoyed the podcasts that they produce. I think they're just excellent, great coaching for parents. I know this is kind of a can of worms, but Joann, what are your thoughts on paid parental leave and the current state of that in the United States?
Well, I think we're still as far away as ever from it being a federal law, and yet it's something that working parents deserve. US is one of 6 countries in the world and the only rich country that doesn't have national paid family and medical leave. But guess what? While we're waiting for something to happen on a national scale, it's happening on a state level. There are 13 states now, plus the District of Columbia, that require paid parental leave for eligible workers. And once that ball starts rolling, and I think 13 is a significant number, it's not going to be too long from now in which more than half of the states have similar policies, in which case companies are going to have to adopt and adapt, and it will put more pressure on Congress.
Not good, right?
Exactly.
So I know that your book really emphasizes the mother-daughter relationship, but I would really love for you to share a little bit about your thoughts about, and you talk about it in your book, moms raising feminist sons. What are the top parenting strategies that you would have in that area about raising sons to be supportive of women?
Well, let's not overlook the daughters first, because you raised that as a part of your question. I'll deal with that quickly and then move on to the
Yeah.
sons. I think it's really important of listening when your daughter is trying to communicate to you, let me be me. And if that means she becomes a starving artist rather than an executive like you, so be it. Because we want all our children to grow up to not only be successful, but happy with what they choose in their lives. I think it's equally important for fathers and mothers to raise feminist sons, because it's the only way that things will change in coming generations. And we do that 2 ways. Number one, we lead by example. Our son Dan saw how involved both Mike and I were as parents. He saw us equally sharing, but not cheerfully sharing those household duties. He saw that when we moved to London and I was working until 9 o'clock at night, that it was Dad who was involved with playing with the kids, getting them ready for bed. And the second thing I think is really important is to teach their sons the importance of treating women fairly at a very early age. I'd like to share one more story. When both of our kids were fairly young, we took them to a children's event that was hosted by our synagogue. And the program leader started the program by saying, "What is prejudice?" Because she planned to talk about anti-Semitism. 5-year-old Dan raised his hand wildly, and she called on him. And he said, I know what prejudice is. It's when they don't let ladies drive buses."
And he was 5?
He was 5.
So highly observant. I love it. All right.
Hey,
So
he's my son, for gosh sake.
exactly. So he's following the modeling for sure. So Tom, do we have any questions? Are there any queries in the chat for Joann?
It wasn't put in as a query, but I think it's a very important point. I'd love to get Joann's thoughts on it.
Yeah.
Sandy said, let's not forget about the single power moms out there and the extra challenges that they experience. And a few others have chimed in to double down on that. So any thoughts on that? I don't know if any of the folks that you interviewed for your book were
Sure.
single power moms.
Yes. There were not a lot, but there were some. And what I found was special about the ones who were raising their children as a single parent is it takes a village. We all remember that line. And they depended extensively not only on the children's grandparents, but their wider network, whether it was sisters, mother-in-laws, in some cases, stay-at-home moms became people that they relied on. And the whole point here was they understood that they couldn't do it by themselves. In one case, a woman who was a single parent for a good part of her children's childhood invited her parents to come live with her, which they did. And yet, somehow they thrived, and their children did as well. But I also want to make the point that it's important that workplaces be cognizant and constantly are taking the temperature of what their employees who are working parents need. There are many working parents who are not only single parents, but who are part of the sandwich generation. They're raising children and they're caring for an aging parent or an aging grandparent. And so you need to be regularly surveying those employees who have kids about what you're doing now and what you should be doing differently to meet those needs.
The other thing I wanted to surface from the chat, someone asked about childcare policies at organizations. We've talked a lot about parental leave, but I'd love to get both of your perspectives on this, Joann, obviously, but also Lorrie, you've done a lot of research on this over the years, a lot of writing. I know there was a trend, organizations, having on-site childcare for larger companies or just larger stipends to pay for it. But with changes due to, remote policies, work from home, companies cutting back on their physical footprint, real estate, it might be a harder challenge to get some of those things through. So thoughts from both of you?
Lorrie, you want to go first, and then I'm happy to chime in.
Sure. I dream of a day when companies view childcare subsidies or benefits in the same way they view healthcare benefits. It is absolutely integral to the success of businesses that want to grow and be competitive to be able to support working parents in their organizations. And Tom and Zeta, I wrote an article that's on our website right now, and I think the title is something along the lines of, I was in a mood when I wrote this, but the talent that you're trying to hire cannot afford to come to work for you. Because by the time they pay for childcare and all the extraneous expenses, they can't afford to come to work for you. And there are some organizations out there that really get it and are really subsidizing or providing creative, sorts of benefits for working parents. But until employers really get it and get their arms around it, I think they're going to not have the competitive edge that the organizations that do get it already have. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. But I also think that employers can go one step further, and they ought to be offering backup care subsidies. Because, in our case, my mom was a teacher, and when our firstborn was sick and neither my husband or I could stay home from work, my mom called in sick to her school. But not everyone has that kind of resource. The other thing that I think employers need to be thinking about is the fact that we have a lot of employees now on a hybrid schedule. Yes, they're coming back to the office maybe 2 or 3 days a week, but then they don't need perhaps full-time childcare slots. And a lot of childcare centers say, fine, you can bring your kid here 2 days a week or 3 days a week, but you're going to be paying for 5 days a week.
Right.
There are services you can offer your employees that will help match that hybrid employee with perhaps someone else in your company or somewhere else, someone at another company who's willing to share a full-time childcare center slot. And so you only then pay for the 2 days a week that you need to be using the childcare center.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. Why is it so difficult? But I am based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Shout out to the folks on the call from Pittsburgh. I saw you signing in. But one of the most impressive employers here in Pittsburgh is Dick's Sporting Goods. They have a gorgeous corporate, headquarters right on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, but they really invested. They built a beautiful childcare facility there that I've had the opportunity to visit. And one of the things that they said is we want to enable top talent to want to come to work for us, but we want to enable them to stay. And this is one of the things that we're investing in is really quality childcare. So an executive or anybody who works there can just, walk a few hundred yards and go check in on their kid during the day. That's just priceless, right?
But there's something else that employers could do that would be great, and that is to follow another pace setter type of action that American Express took. When they made their parental leave more generous and inaugurated 6 months of paid parental leave for everyone, they
wow.
realized this was going to put some strains, particularly on smaller teams who suddenly had nobody to fill a gap for 6 months. And so what they did is they gave first line supervisors a small but meaningful amount of money to hire temporary staff to fill in some of those gaps when a parent was gone for 6 months.
That's fantastic.
Wow, impressive. Well, I think looking at the clock, we're about at time. Lorrie, great job facilitating, and awesome job, Joann. Lorrie, final words from you.
Just this has been a huge highlight for me, Joann. Thank you so much for making time because I know you're super busy. You're continuing to contribute to the Wall Street Journal regularly. So thank you so much for that. I just want to thank you personally and professionally for everything that you've done for women. After this career, which is still ongoing with the Wall Street Journal, you could have chosen to write books about anything, and you chose to write about working women. And I just really appreciate that. So just thank you so much.
You're most welcome, and thank you again for having me on this event today.
Well, again, thank you both. You're getting a lot of love with the emojis flying up on screen and in the chat, including folks who aren't parents yet, but maybe looking to be working parents soon. I think everyone got a lot of great tips. Want to remind everyone that, as always, Next Practice is weekly. If you attend the call like you did today, it's available for a recertification credit hour from both HRCI or SHRM. So just jot down the highlighted program ID or activity ID that you see on the screen or that Zeta a few minutes ago had put into the chat. Also want to encourage folks, as Zeta's putting in the chat, connect with Joann on LinkedIn. She welcomes those connections. She's also provided her email address over in the chat. You can also visit and learn more about her at joannlublin.com. All of that linked over there in the chat. So please do connect with her. She'd love to meet more folks who were on the call today. All right, with that, we're going to close. Thank you again, Joann, Lorrie, Matt, and Zeta. Great session. Hope to see everyone again next week when we'll have two guests from Accenture as our special guests. Until then, have a great weekend, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Joann. You're awesome.